He knows that his lover has mysteriously left him, and we find him in great pain. But
22 years, 2 sons, one Italian villa, and a life that looked, from every available angle, like the kind of love story most people only ever witness in films. And then, in 2019, it collapsed so completely and in such a specific way that Colin Firth didn't just lose his marriage. He found out he had been used as a weapon against an innocent man, all while believing he was simply protecting the woman he loved. That is where this story actually lives. Not in box office numbers or career timelines or the tabloid shorthand of celebrity divorce. It lives in the question that must have kept him awake in that London house after the divorce finalized, and the world locked down, and there was nowhere left to hide from the answer. How do you rebuild an identity when the relationship you organized your entire adult life around turns out to have been, at its core, a lie? Colin Firth arrived in the world in 1960 in Hampshire, born to parents who were far more fluent in ideas than in feelings. His father lectured in history. His mother specialized in comparative religion. Dinner conversations circled around Kant and theology rather than the messier business of emotional life, and young Colin absorbed that dynamic completely. Bright, sensitive, and carrying feelings he had no framework for, the boy grew up in a home where intellect was the currency, and interiority was something you managed quietly rather than expressed openly. Drama gave him the framework his home life never did. What casting directors eventually spotted in him, after the rejection letters piled up and the callbacks stayed rare, was something no acting class could manufacture. Colin Firth could convey pain without a single word, and the industry, when it finally caught up with him, would spend decades building mythologies around exactly that quality. The mythology arrived fully formed in 1995, when the BBC broadcast its adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and the world met Mr. Darcy walking out of that lake in a wet shirt. That scene became cultural shorthand almost overnight for a specific kind of restrained longing that Britain at that particular moment was hungry for. Colin didn't chase what followed. The Bridget Jones films deepened the belief further. Mark Darcy was the man who chose you because of your chaos rather than despite it, and audiences worldwide concluded that Colin Firth was that man in real life too. Not just the actor, the actual human being. He never corrected them. The gracious interviews, the deflected personal questions, the steady projection of contentment, all of it fed the narrative, and somewhere along the way, Colin himself began accommodating it as though it were true. The Oscar in 2011 for The King's Speech landed with a symbolism that was almost too neat for anyone paying attention. Here stood Colin Firth, celebrated for playing a king who struggled to speak his own truth in public while finding the courage to do it anyway. And meanwhile, Colin himself had spent years swallowing more and more of his own. The acceptance speech he delivered that night was warm, self-deprecating, and completely unreadable. Not a trace of whatever was genuinely happening underneath. The performance, as always, held. Livia Jolie entered his life in the early 1990s on the set of a BBC miniseries filming in Italy, where she worked as a production assistant and was, by every account, magnetic in ways that made Colin's careful reserve look like it had been waiting for exactly this disruption. Spontaneous where he was methodical, driven by convictions that went well beyond the entertainment industry, Livia cared about the environment and art and making a tangible difference. And that authenticity hooked him in a way celebrity attention never had. Friends who witnessed the early stages said he was completely disarmed by her, and for a man who had spent his whole life keeping the armor polished even while bleeding underneath, being disarmed felt less like vulnerability and more like finally exhaling. Their wedding came in 1997, a private ceremony kept clear of the celebrity machinery Colin had always distrusted. Matteo was born after the marriage, but Luca, their eldest, came before it, the son of a previous relationship of Livia's. Colin adopted Luca without hesitation, without conditions, without any apparent period of deliberation, and the world saw this as confirmation of something it had already decided about Colin Firth. What the world missed was the dynamic this established from the very start. Here was a man bending himself to accommodate a situation, proving through action that he deserved his place in the family he was helping build. That kind of love is generous on the surface, but underneath it, there is usually a quiet fear of not being enough. Colin gave freely and asked for almost nothing back, and the reason people do that, more often than not, is that asking feels like confirming you might not deserve what you have. The family split time between London and the Umbrian villa that became Livia's central passion project, a sprawling property she transformed into an eco-conscious space hosting environmental activists and sustainability workshops. Colin funded all of it without question. What people close to them noticed over the years was a consistent pattern. Livia made the decisions. Colin agreed. Livia held strong opinions about which of his roles had merit and which compromised the family's values. He deferred. Every interview praised her in the same specific way, describing her as his anchor, his inspiration, the reason he could do the work. The praise was always philosophical, never emotional. Always about what she represented, never about what she gave him. That distinction, easy to miss in any single interview, accumulated into something telling over time. In 2018, Italian media broke the news that Livia had filed stalking charges against Marco Brancaccia, a journalist she had known since childhood. She claimed years of harassment, threatening messages, unwanted contact, a sustained campaign of intimidation. Colin released a public statement immediately, standing by his wife completely. British press framed it as straightforward victimhood, and Marco Brancaccia found himself cast as the villain in a narrative that Colin's name and credibility helped cement in the public mind. The actual situation was different, and here's where it gets worse. During 2015 and 2016, Colin and Livia had quietly separated, telling only a handful of close friends. During that period, Livia reconnected with Marco, and what began as reconnection became a full affair. They were seen together in Italy outside the reach of British tabloids. When Livia and Colin reconciled in late 2016, she ended things with Marco, and Marco did not handle the ending well. The messages that followed were raw and angry, the kind of contact that comes from someone who feels used and discarded rather than someone who was ever dangerous. Colin, who had no reason yet to question his wife's version of anything, believed her completely. His money funded the legal proceedings. His name and his lawyers and his public standing all backed her account. In 2019, Livia withdrew the charges entirely, releasing a statement acknowledging the relationship with Marco had been consensual and that she had misrepresented the nature of his contact after it ended. Marco had the receipts, messages showing not a predator pursuing a victim, but two people who had shared a real relationship, one of whom then tried to use the legal system to rewrite that history into something more convenient for her marriage. Italian press responded with fury. British tabloids mostly looked away. None of that softened the damage for Colin, which was internal and total. The deeper wound wasn't just infidelity. It was that his love had been converted into an instrument of someone else's deception, that his public defense had helped damage the reputation of an innocent man, that the 22 years he had believed in so completely now needed to be reviewed through a different lens. When you are betrayed by someone you trusted, you grieve the relationship. When you realize the betrayal ran deep enough to turn your devotion into a weapon, you start grieving your own judgment, and that is a harder grief because it doesn't let you off the hook as the victim. Formal separation came in December 2019, announced in a statement with the smooth, airless quality of language negotiated by multiple lawyers. Colin showed up to events that awards season alone, smiled for cameras, gave thoughtful interviews, and nobody watching would have guessed the degree to which his life had become rubble. Divorce finalized in 2020, and then the world locked down, and Colin found himself with nothing to escape into. No set to arrive at, no character to disappear inside. Just the silence of a London home that had once been shared and no longer was. People who knew him during that period described someone noticeably quieter, the easy warmth still present but costing him something now. Therapy helped, apparently, forcing him to look honestly at his own patterns, the accommodating, the deferring, the years of convincing himself that being needed was the same as being loved. Career pressures arrived alongside the personal ones. The roles that had defined Colin Firth were going to men in their 40s. Hollywood's appetite for him had shifted from leading man to distinguished supporting presence. The Kingsman franchise became his most consistent work, fun and profitable, and absolutely not what wins Academy Awards. Projects he might previously have passed on became projects he accepted, because the financial reality of post-divorce life across two countries is different from the financial reality of a long marriage. There is a specific grief in watching your professional peak recede while the wreckage of your private life keeps demanding your attention, and Colin carried both without public complaint. Tabloids tracked his romantic life after the divorce with an intensity that made genuine human connection nearly impossible. The difficulty was never finding people attracted to Colin Firth. The difficulty was finding people attracted to Colin, the actual man behind the name, rather than the access and the story. People who spent time with him described someone warm and attentive in conversation, but fundamentally closed in the places that mattered, deflecting anything genuinely personal back toward safer subjects. That isn't coldness. That's someone who has been taught by experience that openness is where you get hurt. By 2025, Colin Firth works on independent films that value craft over scale and has returned to theater, back to standing in front of a live audience with no second takes and no safety net between what he is in that moment and what the audience receives. The stage demands a different kind of honesty, and perhaps that's exactly the point. At 65, both sons are adults living their own lives. The Italian villa exists somewhere in the middle distance of his past. What remains is the craft that was his first language long before fame or marriage came along to complicate everything, and the ongoing project of figuring out who Colin Firth actually is when no performance is required. That project doesn't arrive at a tidy conclusion. But what seems clear is this: a man who gave enormously and freely, without sufficient regard for his own needs, who had that generosity turned against him in ways he could not have anticipated, and who has refused to become publicly diminished or bitter by any of it. The grace that audiences always projected onto him turns out not to have been entirely a performance. Some of it, apparently, was just the man himself.